What is up, my beautiful gemstones? Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, thanks for checking us out. My name is Gemma Jade, but today we are going to be discussing the brutal unsolved death of Elizabeth Short, aka the infamous Black Dahlia murder, and let me tell you guys, this has been a long time coming on this channel. It's never easy to talk about murder and people who have obviously died before their time, and it's even harder to make sense sometimes of the things that human beings are capable of doing to other human beings. Sometimes something happens that is so incredibly bizarre that we can't help but pay close attention to it and see where it ends up leading, even if the information we receive is quite hard to digest. That's especially true in a lot of unsolved murders and other mysteries that we discuss here on this channel all the time. The death of a celebrity or someone well known is so often talked about nonstop in the media, and the salacious details are often too much for any of us to turn away from. It's no different in the case of Elizabeth Short, whose desperate need to be famous and want for a better life for herself caused her to possibly take some unnecessary risks, trust the wrong people, and end up becoming famous indeed, perhaps even infamous for all the wrong reasons. It's been decades since her body was found in a vacant lot in Los Angeles, and still the public is fascinated by not only her death, but her life as well, which sometimes seems equally as mysterious. Her murder is still unsolved, and it's sad to say that maybe she achieved what she set out to achieve in the long run anyway, as her face is recognizable across the country, everybody knows her name, which is, after all, what being a celebrity is kind of all about. Let's take a look at the life and death of the Black Dahlia, or at least what we know about each, and see if we can figure out what makes this case so unsolvable, but also so interesting that it's been able to keep the attention of the public for all these years. Before we jump in today, I would like to thank my members and patrons and everyone who supports me on this channel in any way, shape, or form from the bottom of my heart. Financial donations of any kind help ensure that I am paid for the work that I do, which is a lot of work, about 80 hours a week, but also sharing the video, being subscribed, getting notified of everything I put out, ordering things from me personally, including readings, purchasing my books and paying extra for autographs, commenting at least 7 characters in the comment section, and watching or listening to everything all the way through helps in ways you can never possibly understand if you aren't also working on YouTube. I just appreciate all of you and all of the love and support that you give me financially and otherwise every single day and behind every single thing I do. I love you all so much. Let's jump right in. This is a case of someone who desperately wanted to be famous in her life, but only came to be extremely well known due to the circumstances surrounding her death. Elizabeth Short may not be a name you're familiar with, but the name she was given by the press at the time of her gruesome murder might be one you've heard of. Elizabeth Short has come to be known as the Black Dahlia, and her case is still unsolved today, almost 8 decades later. Elizabeth Short was born on July 29, 1924, in the Hyde Park neighborhood of Boston, Massachusetts. A Leo. Now, I'm not really surprised that she was looking for fame, and I'm sure that the rest of her chart aligned right with that. Elizabeth did have a bit of a rough and kind of scattered upbringing and spent some time in Florida and parts of New England before eventually relocating to California, where her biological father lived at the time. For most of her life, Elizabeth thought that her father had taken his own life, as did the rest of her family, her 4 sisters and mother, because his car had been found abandoned on a bridge, and due to his having lost everything in the stock market crash of 1929, they all just assumed the worst, the authorities as well. They found his car abandoned on this very high bridge that was known for people taking their own lives, with all of his information and stuff in it, and he was presumed dead, that he had taken his own life. However, in 1942, her mother received a letter of apology from her estranged and presumed dead husband, and he told her he had merely ran off to California to start a new life and had been alive all along. Elizabeth went to stay with her father that same year in December of 1942 when she was just 18 years old. She hadn't seen him since she was 6, and constant arguments with her father caused her to leave his home just a month later, in January of 1943, in order to try and strike out on her own and achieve her goals of becoming a Hollywood movie star. On September 23, 1943, Elizabeth was arrested at a bar in Santa Barbara where she'd been living with a man who was allegedly very abusive towards her, and in response to the charges against her, the juvenile authorities sent her back to her mother in Massachusetts. However, Elizabeth didn't want to to return home and instead went to Florida and only visited with her family in Boston every once in a while. While in Florida at that time, Elizabeth met a decorated Army Air Force officer named Major Matthew Gordon, and he was in training for deployment to Southeast Asian theater during World War II. Major Gordon had gotten into a plane crash in India after being deployed, and while he was recovering and during his convalescence, he'd written to Elizabeth and asked for her hand in marriage. She did say yes to his proposal, but before they could actually tie the knot, Major Gordon died in a second plane crash while deployed overseas on August 10, 1945. In July of 1946, Elizabeth moved to Los Angeles in order to reconnect with an acquaintance of hers from Florida, a man named Army Air Force Lieutenant Joseph Fickling, who was stationed at the Naval Reserve Air Base in Long Beach, California. Elizabeth Short would be brutally murdered sometime within the next 6 months. Immediately before her death, in her final months, she had gotten a job working as a waitress and rented a room behind the Florentine Gardens nightclub of Hollywood Boulevard. Though she had no known acting jobs or film credits to her name, it was widely known in the area and within her small circle of friends and acquaintances that Elizabeth wanted to be a star and would stop at nothing to make that dream come true. On January 9th, 1947, one of the many men Elizabeth had been dating at the time, a married 25-year-old man named Red Manning, said that they'd just gotten back from a trip they'd taken together to San Diego and that he'd dropped her off at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles because she said she had an appointment to meet with one of her sisters who had allegedly been visiting from Boston that afternoon. She said they were going to have lunch and just spend some time together. Some people who were later questioned said that they thought they'd remember seeing her there using the public telephone in the lobby that day, seemingly verifying Red Manning's story. Shortly after she was seen in the lobby of the Biltmore, other people saw Elizabeth at the Crown Grill Cocktail Lounge on Olive Street, which was only about 3/4 of a mile away from the Biltmore. There isn't much known really about where she actually was, what she was doing, or who she was with from the 9th leading up to the day that her body was discovered. And those people that saw her in the lobby of the Biltmore, they only thought they might have seen her. It wasn't like she was definitely there. There have also been some reports that she was last seen having a drink at the Cecil Hotel, or what is now called the Stay on Main. We're going to be discussing that infamous elevator footage of Elisa Lambs in the coming weeks. I am working on covering her case, but people have tried to make the connection from the Black Dahlia to the Cecil for a really long time, and I haven't yet been able to figure out if she was actually there or really where she was. But according to Red Manning, he had dropped her off at the Biltmore, and some people seem to be able to verify that alibi. On the morning of January 15th, 1947, a mother on a walk with her small child in the Los Angeles area came across a macabre sight as they passed by the mostly undeveloped land and a vacant parking lot on the west side of South Norton Avenue. At first, the mother thought they were looking at a store mannequin lying there in 2 pieces, but as she approached and got a closer look, she was able to see that she was staring at the body of a human female, severed in 2 and completely naked. This woman's mutilated body was completely and skillfully severed at the waist, and she'd been completely exsanguinated, so not a drop of blood left in the body. This caused her skin to be a pallid white color, which stood out against her very dark black hair. Medical examiners determined that she'd been deceased for 10 hours prior to her body being found, and this led them to conclude that her time of death was either sometime during the night of the 14th or during the early morning hours of the 15th, so sometime within the previous 10 hours from when she'd been found. The upper portion of the body had been wiped clean with gasoline by whoever killed her, and her mouth was cut in such a way that she seemed to be smiling a gruesome smile literally from ear to ear. Think the Batman's Joker. The effect of the slices from her mouth to her ears is what's known as a Glasgow smile. There were sections of her thighs and breasts where flesh were purposely cut away, and the lower half of her body was positioned approximately 1 foot away from her upper half. Her intestines had been purposely and neatly placed underneath her buttocks. Her corpse had been posed with her hands above her head, elbows bent at right angles, and with her legs spread widely apart in what authorities thought was an effort by the killer to further humiliate this victim. The detectives on the scene that morning discovered a cement stack containing watery blood and a heel impression in the ground near some of the tire tracks in the area. An autopsy of Elizabeth's body was performed the next day on January 16th, and the report stated that there were ligature marks on her wrists, ankles, and neck, and that there was, quote, an irregular laceration with superficial tissue loss, end quote, on her right breast. There were what were called superficial lacerations on several other areas of her body as well. Elizabeth's body was found to have been cut in half using a specific and very precise medical technique called hemicorporectomy. While no biological male evidence was found when tested, some things the coroner noted on the body led some investigators and the coroner himself to believe that she might have actually been sexually assaulted. They were never able to prove she'd been one way or another, though. Elizabeth was only able to be identified from her fingerprints on file due to her arrest for underage drinking back in 1943, and immediately following the identification, reporters called her mother Phoebe and told her that her daughter had won a beauty contest and that they wanted some information about her so that they could do a story about her big win. Only after prying as much information about Elizabeth as possible out of her mother did the reporters tell her why they were really doing a story about her daughter, what had really happened to her, that her daughter had been brutally, violently, and viciously murdered. However, this turned out to be just another ruse and lie, as once Phoebe arrived in Los Angeles, the Examiner did everything they could to keep her from the detectives working her daughter's case, hoping to keep their story as exclusive as possible before going to print. The Examiner and another paper owned by Hearst Newspaper Company, the Herald Express, both sensationalized the case as much as possible and did everything they could to make this case as sexualized as possible. For example, they described the black tailored suit Elizabeth had last been seen wearing as, quote, a tight skirt and sheer blouse, end quote. They nicknamed her the Black Dahlia and described her as, quote, an adventuress who prowled along Hollywood Boulevard, end quote. Another newspaper in the area on January 17th said that the murder had been, quote, a sex fiend slaying, end quote. On the 21st of January, a person claiming to be Elizabeth's killer called the editor of the Examiner newspaper and actually congratulated him on his wonderful coverage of the case in his paper. The man said he planned on eventually turning himself in, but that he wanted police to further pursue him a little bit first. The unknown caller also told the editor to, quote, expect some souvenirs of Beth Short in the mail, end quote. 3 days later, a suspicious-looking manila envelope was found addressed to the Los Angeles Examiner and other Los Angeles papers, and it was addressed with each letter of each word carefully clipped out, cut out of newspapers and magazines. You guys can picture that in your head, right? The little like ransom note style cutout notes. The large message on the front said, quote, here's Dahlia's belongings, letter to follow, end quote. Just like Elizabeth's body, the package had been carefully cleaned with gasoline in an effort to get rid of any evidence that could be left behind by the killer or whoever had sent it. Inside of the envelope was her birth certificate, photographs, her business cards, and names written on small pieces of paper. A small address book with the name Mark Hansen written on the cover was also contained inside. Just to show you guys how the media really did try to sexually sensationalize this case, they always referred to this, and still do to this day, as her little black book. It was just a regular address book. It just happened to be black and small. So the police believed that whoever was sending the letters and who had made the initial call to the newspaper really was the person who had killed Elizabeth Short. The similarities in how the body and the evidence had been cleaned, not to mention the fact that whoever this was really did have all of her possessions on them. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to send them, right? So this person more than likely was the killer. Despite trying their best to get rid of any evidence that might be left on the envelope, meaning the killer, the police were actually able to lift several partial fingerprints, and those were sent to the FBI for further analysis and testing. However, before they'd even reached the FBI's office, the fingerprints were somehow compromised during transit and ended up being useless because they weren't able to be properly analyzed or with whatever had happened to them along the way. Something had contaminated them accidentally on their way from the LAPD to whichever FBI office they were being sent to. On the same day the Examiner received that envelope, a handbag and one black suede shoe were reportedly seen on top of a dumpster near where Elizabeth's body had originally been found, approximately only 2 miles away from the crime scene. While those items were recovered by investigators, they were unable to be analyzed due to them having been wiped clean with gasoline, destroying any fingerprints that might have otherwise been there and anything else that might have been of use to them. On March 14th, the authorities were called when an apparent note was left behind from someone who had apparently unalived themselves. A caretaker of the beach had first seen it and immediately reported what he'd found to a nearby lifeguard named John Dillon. The note itself was found inside of a shoe on top of a pile of men's clothing found at the ocean's edge at the bottom of Breeze Avenue in Venice, California. The connection to this case was made once the note was read. It read, quote, "To whom it may concern, I have waited for the police to capture me for the Black Dahlia killing, but they have not. I am too much of a coward to turn myself in, so this was the best way out for me. I couldn't help myself for that or this. Sorry, Mary," end quote. John Dillon immediately notified the police and Captain L.E. Christensen from the West Los Angeles Police Station, and he was the first to arrive on scene. The clothes include blue trousers and a matching coat, both made of herringbone tweed, a t-shirt that was brown and white in color, and tan socks. A size 8 men's tan moccasin leisure shoes were also found there, within which the note was left. Nothing contained in the clothes or around them gave any clue as to who they belonged to, and nothing at all seems to have come from this discovery, though, and the police hit yet another dead end in the Black Dahlia case. I'm not 100% sure on this, so don't quote me, but I do believe I remember going back and looking, and the moccasin leisure shoe did not, in fact, match the heel impressions that were at the crime scene, so it's just another reason why the police didn't think this really had any connection, and also I don't believe they were ever able to find out who this man was, like where was the body, and people to this day are pretty sure this was just some nasty joke or prank being played to waste police time, maybe by the killer, maybe not, but it's kind of like it was a red herring or whatever. Mark Hansen, the person whose name was embossed on the front of the little black address book found in Elizabeth's possessions, was immediately considered a suspect by the police. Mark was a very wealthy theater and nightclub owner with whom she'd stayed very briefly with some friends. Mark Hansen is also the one who was able to confirm that the shoe and handbag found on the dumpster had belonged to Elizabeth, and the more they investigated him, the more sus he looked to them. Ann Toth, who was Elizabeth's good friend and at one time had also been her roommate, told investigators that right before she was murdered, Elizabeth had rejected Mark's sexual advances towards her, which made the police believe that could have been a potential motive for him to have killed her. However, it didn't take too long for them to clear him of all suspicion, though I couldn't find much information on what their process was or how they came to the eventual conclusion that he wasn't the one who killed her. In the weeks and months following the murder, the police interviewed a little over 150 men who were believed that they could have been potential suspects. Robert Manley was the last person besides her killer known to have seen her alive, but the authorities were able to clear him after several intense interrogations of him and after he passed several polygraph tests as to his alibi for that day. The police went through the address book and also questioned several people who were listed inside of it as well, but they never came up with good enough suspects to prosecute. Everyone was eventually, and usually fairly quickly, cleared of any involvement in Elizabeth's murder. They had reached yet another dead end of many. 750 investigators from the LAPD and other agencies across California worked on Elizabeth's case during the beginning and initial stages of the investigation. Various locations were gone through and searched as well, but no additional evidence was ever found. Therefore, I'm not going to go through each and every single place and space they searched for how long and all of that. A city councilman in Los Angeles at the time named Lloyd G. Davis offered a $10,000 reward for information leading the police to Elizabeth's killer, which would be the equivalent to somewhere around $142,000 in today's money. But aside from some people claiming to know things they didn't in an effort to get their hands on that money, it never helped turn up any real new information in this case. Several people came forward with false confessions, again in an effort to get their hands on the money, which was a massive sum at the time, and they were all charged with obstruction of justice for their efforts. On January 26th, another letter was received by the Examiner, but this time it was handwritten. It said, quote, "Here it is, turning in Wednesday, January 29th at 10 a.m. Had my fun at police, Black Dahlia Avenger," end quote. The letter also contained a location where this person, alleging to be the killer, said he would turn himself in. The authorities waited there for him, but no one ever showed up. Instead, the Examiner newspaper received another one of those cut and paste letters at approximately the same time, 10 that morning when he was supposed to have turned himself in, and it read, quote, "Have changed my mind. You would not give me a square deal. Dahlia killing was justified," end quote. Obviously, with the extremely graphic nature of this case and with the constant and consistent communication from the killer to the news media, a circus erupted around the case. Local and national publications reported on this case almost constantly, but most of the information they were putting out into the public realm was highly and heavily sensationalized and wholly false. However, the police allowed the publications to continue to publicize false information because they wanted to keep her actual cause of death private. The newspaper showed no tact and no concern for the fact that this was a woman, a young woman, and a whole human being who had been brutally slaughtered at such a young age for no discernible reason. They posted intimate details of her personal and sex life, regardless of whether or not the information they were putting out there was true. It didn't matter to them because their main objective wasn't to help solve the murder, but to sell more papers, and if they happened to help solve it in the process, then all the better, but who cared? They disclosed information about her alleged rebuttal of Mark Hansen's advances just before her death, and they interviewed an exotic dancer who was a known acquaintance of Elizabeth's when she died. The stripper said, quote, she liked to get guys worked up over her, but she'd leave them hanging dry, end quote. Now, just a little aside, many attractive women in their 20s behave this way nowadays, and it's not considered a big deal. It's kind of what these types of women do. But back in the 40s, this was salacious and was sometimes even meant to sabotage her character and victim shame and victim blame. Understand, please, that that is not what I am intending to do by any means, just so we're clear. Due to how many people came forward saying these sorts of things about how Elizabeth liked to get men all worked up and tease them just to leave them and refuse their advances, some reporters and also some of the investigators started speculating that perhaps she was a lesbian, because she couldn't possibly just have had no interest in these particular men, right? They started questioning patrons and employees of any and all known local gay bars, but they never had any luck in substantiating these theories about her, probably because she was simply a tease and she wasn't a lesbian at all. So back during this time, the time this murder took place, and a long time before it, I'm sure, as it happens today as well, only now women and some men are much more obvious about it, there was this thing in the culture where women did what was known as dating for dinner. And more than likely, due to how low on money she always was and how she could barely afford to pay her bills all the time, let alone her rent, this is what Elizabeth was known to have done. She would accept dates with all different men, sometimes more than one in a day, and go out with them not because she was interested in sleeping with them or with being in any sort of romantic relationship with them, but simply because she had to find a way to eat that day. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying this is what she and a lot of other women at the time did, and what a lot of women and some men still do to this day. All right? You can have your opinions about this practice all you want, but until you've been there yourself, I'm not really interested in hearing anyone talk badly about her because of this, all right? Anyway, the Herald Express newspaper received more letters from the person suspected of being the actual murderer, and one of them said, quote, I will give up Dahlia killing if I get 10 years. Don't try to find me, end quote. All of them were in that exact same newspaper and magazine clipping style, but none of them ever led anywhere. The Examiner continued to run stories about the murder, sensationalizing every possible detail for 35 continuous days after the discovery of the body, but the authorities were no closer to solving the crime for any of it. Lead investigator Captain Jack Donahue spoke with the press often, and he told them that he believed the murder took place in a remote building or shack somewhere on the outskirts of Los Angeles, and that her body had been transported somehow to the lot where it was eventually found. Based on the precision of the cuts and how precise the dissection of her body was, the LAPD looked into the possibility that the killer was some sort of doctor, surgeon, or at the very least, someone with extensive medical knowledge. In February of 1947, while following this train of thought, the LAPD served a warrant on the University of Southern California Medical School, which wasn't located too far from where the body was discovered, and requested a complete list of every single one of the medical program students at that time. The school agreed to hand over the requested information as long as the personal information and identities of those students, including their names, remained sealed in order to protect their privacy. The LAPD agreed and ran background checks on each and every single student enrolled in that school's medical program, but everyone was cleared, and it was simply another dead end and waste of time. By the time the spring of 1947 rolled around, the Black Dahlia case, as it's infamously come to be known, was a cold case with no new leads coming in at all. One of the other leading detectives on the case, a man named Finis Brown, publicly blamed the press for the lack of forward movement in the case. He said the journalists' severe probing of irrelevant details and unverified reporting made it so that the case had become too over-sensationalized. In September of 1949, a grand jury was convened to discuss inadequacies in the LAPD's homicide unit and their failure to solve not only this murder, but numerous others, specifically and especially those of women and children, in the several years previous to Elizabeth's murder, and her murder was in fact one they were convening to discuss. Possibly due to this grand jury, it seems as though more effort was put into Elizabeth's case in the aftermath of it. Detectives went so far as to trace her movements from and between Massachusetts, Florida, and California, and they interviewed people she knew well in Texas and New Orleans. However, none of the interviews conducted or effort put into all of this yielded any new or any useful information, and once again, the case was as cold as ice. Due to the extreme notoriety of this case, many false confessions had been given throughout the years. During the initial investigation, the police received a total of 60 of them, and since that time, up until today, at least 500 different people have confessed to being the Black Dahlia's killer. I want to talk about one suspect particularly who came up in this investigation in the years since the murder happened, and you can call it a personal as well as a professional interest on my part. I don't discuss my spiritual abilities at all when covering true crime cases, but hopefully most of you know me well enough to know why I am pointing to one specific person who was briefly considered a suspect by investigators, but other than that, I'm not going to say anything further, at least not personally. I want to bring to your attention a man named George Hodel. Now, this man isn't in my periphery for no reason, but he's also been brought to the attention of the public and investigators alike, and he received widespread notoriety regarding this case when his own son accused him of being Elizabeth Short's murderer. Steve Hodel, George's son, is a former LAPD homicide detective, and he publicly accused his own father, George, of not only being the killer in this case, but of committing several other murders and various other crimes as well. Prior to Elizabeth's murder, George Hodel was suspected of, but never charged with, the death of his secretary, a woman named Ruth Spaulding. He was also accused of sexually assaulting, or more specifically, R-wording his own daughter. His daughter's name is Tamar, and he was acquitted of those charges. In my opinion, after listening to what Tamar had to say, I believe, so I just want to make it clear I'm not making any factual statement here about this man's guilt or innocence, but in my opinion, he should have been locked up and the keys should have been thrown away. Furthermore, he should have been subjected to the exact same crime he committed against his own child, who looked to him for love, support, and guidance. As someone who has a very loving relationship with my own father, who for all his faults and eccentricities, and for the fact as well that he's been in active addiction for 30 plus years, he's still my hero and a safe place for me to go to whenever I need, with whatever I might need. Hodel also fled the country several times and even lived in the Philippines several times between 1950 and 1990. In 2003, some notes from the grand jury that we just talked about, the one that convened in 1949, were revealed, and a wiretap of George Hodel's home was quite revealing. During a recorded conversation between him and a visitor in his home at the time, George can be heard on the recording saying, quote, "Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia, they couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary because she's dead," end quote. Referring, of course, to Ruth Spaulding, whose murder he was highly suspected of having committed, but her case ended up being, officially classified as that she had taken her own life, even though they had brought him in as a murder suspect. So I don't know what was going on there. Now, I'm going to get more into George Hodel soon, but I wanted to first bring up one other suspect in the case because this one allegedly has a witness attached to it. In 1991, a woman named Janice Knowlton came forward and said that she was 10 at the time of the Black Dahlia murder and that she had seen with her own eyes her father beat Elizabeth Short to death with a claw hammer in the detached garage of her family home in Westminster. In 1995, she published a book about what she had allegedly seen and called it "My Daddy Was the Black Dahlia Killer." In that book, she made additional claims that her father had sexually abused her as well. Janice's stepsister, a woman named Jolene Emerson, called the book trash and said about it, quote, "She believed it, but it wasn't reality. I know because I lived with her father for 16 years, end quote. So Janice was the biological daughter of the man she was accusing, and her stepsister was not his biological child and stood up for and defended him anyway. I don't know what happened here with this one, but it wasn't worth a further look or a deeper dive for me because, in my opinion, this is not the man who killed Elizabeth Short. My opinion, meaning my spiritual knowledge, knows that he did not do it. Additionally, one of the lead detectives on the case said that the book Janice wrote and the so-called facts and evidence she presented within that book, quote, were not consistent with the facts of the case, end quote. In 2017, another book was published called Black Dahlia, Red Rose, and this one was written by P.U. Eatwell, and it focuses on a bellhop and former mortician's assistant and his associates Mark Hansen and Jeff Connors. The author theorizes that Elizabeth was murdered because of her close connection with Hansen and the fact that they believe, meaning the author, that Hansen was corrupt and in some sort of hotel scheme involving Connors. This all came from lead detective Finis Brown, who claimed to have uncovered information pointing to Hansen's corruption and involvement with and into all of these illegal things. Allegedly, and according to this author, Connors and Hansen were involved together in some sort of hotel robbing scheme. She further posits that Elizabeth was murdered in the Astor Motel in Los Angeles, but only mainly because the owners of that same motel found a room that was, quote, covered in blood and fecal matter, end quote, on the same morning her body was found. In 1949, however, LAPD Chief William Wharton addressed the situation and allegations about the Astor, and he denied it had anything to do with the case at all. The Los Angeles Herald, though, reported that the murder had actually happened there, even without any proof or evidence that it had, and even with the police chief denying those claims. That's exactly what I was talking about here before when I mentioned the unverified reporting that caused so many problems and so much confusion in this case. Now, let's get back to George Hodel for a few moments before we wrap things up, and if you're interested in this case at all and want to learn more about it, I suggest reading Steve Hodel's book about why he believes his father was Elizabeth Short's murder. I think there's a documentary about it as well, but I don't remember the name of it. George Hodel was born on October 10th, 1907, and he was raised in Los Angeles, California. He graduated from South Pasadena High School early at the age of 15 and enrolled in the California Institute of Technology. However, after only attending that school for 1 year, George had to leave the school because of some sex scandal he was involved in, which also involved the wife of one of his professors. Apparently, George had gotten the woman pregnant and wouldn't leave her alone afterwards because he wanted them to raise the child together, but she refused to have anything more to do with him. He went on to further his education still, though, and received his medical degree in June of 1936. Hodel conducted and ran his own medical practice and became the head of the county's social hygiene board, all of which made him able to move around in the very highly affluent circles of Los Angeles at the time. He was married to several women, all at the same time, including common law marriages, and in fact, he had to call his one wife, whose name was Dorothy Dorero, in order to not confuse her with his other wife, who had the same first name. By the late 1940s, he was a total and legitimate, effective polygamist. When Elizabeth Short was killed, George was living with his wife Dorothy and their 3 children they had together, with his second wife Dorothy, who was actually his first legal wife, and I believe by law you could only have one legal wife, so basically living with his wife and his mistress and his mistress's 3 kids. That got confusing. This is a mess, and I already don't like this guy before knowing anything about what he'd done to Elizabeth Short and his poor secretary Ruth Spaulding, allegedly, who, by the way, most sources do cite her, I had to go back and look, as, quote, an apparent suicide, end quote, as far as who killed her or how she died. At the same time, George was also living with the children from his first legal wife, including Tamar Hodel, who would accuse him of sexual assault years later, for which he would be acquitted. But he wasn't done there. George lived with the 2 Dorothys and also his original common-law wife, whose name was Amelia, along with their oldest child, who was an adult at that time. George wasn't happy with only having 3 wives living in harmony under the same roof and getting away with it. He needed more, and he was known to take temporary lovers on the side as well, with his wives, all of their knowledge. This is where Elizabeth Short possibly comes into the picture. In March of 1950, he went to Hawaii, which was a U.S. territory at the time, and while there, he married a wealthy and well-to-do woman named Hortensia Laguda, who was a Filipino descent. They had 4 children of their own together and divorced in 1960. Hortensia would go on to become a member of the Filipino Congress under the name of Hortensia Stark. He returned to San Francisco in 1990 and lived there for the rest of his life. During that time, he married his 4th legal wife named June. I don't know why my source material keeps specifying that these were legal wives when it seems to me they were anything but, and only his first real legal marriage was legally binding and real, but as usual, I digress, and it's neither here nor there, and I only told you about all of this to kind of show you what the character of this man was like. George Hodel died at the age of 91 years old in May of 1999. In 1949, when his daughter accused him of sexually abusing her for most of her life, George Hodel's name officially hit the police's radar in the Dahlia case because all known or suspected sex criminals in the area were being investigated at the time. During the trial with his daughter Tamar, she allegedly accused him of having murdered Elizabeth Short as well. His medical degree aroused even more suspicion if you remember what particular sets of skills the authorities thought her killer would have to have possessed. At least 8 witnesses claim to have had first-hand knowledge about a sexual and romantic relationship between Elizabeth and George, and we've discussed the investigation stemming from this a little bit, and I read to you one of the recordings that make him such a huge suspect here in this case. I'm not trying to make this video too long, so let's talk a little about some of the other crimes George Hodel was suspected of committing. In June of 1949, there was the murder of a woman named Louise Springer, which the press dubbed the Green Twig murder. However, evidence to support George's involvement in this wasn't publicly available for whatever reason, and though isn't stated specifically, I believe it has to do with DNA evidence until June of 2018. In October of 1949, his name was mentioned in the grand jury proceedings where he was named one of 5 official suspects in the Elizabeth Short / Black Dahlia case. Due to the investigation being ongoing at the time, none of these 5 suspects were submitted for consideration of indictment at that time. George used his psychiatry degree to counsel prisoners in the Territorial Prison of Hawaii for 3 years while he was there, and then he moved to the Philippines and started the aforementioned new family there as well. His son Steve wrote in his book that he believed his father re-entered the United States several times each year for 30 years, from 1858 until 1988 when he returned for good, and specifically that he did so from 1966 to 1969 in order to commit more murders before returning or fleeing once again to the Philippines. I want to talk about one more thing before I go, and that's a statement I found in a lot of my source material, and so when I find information exactly the same across several different reputable sites, I tend to believe it. One site in particular wrote it out beautifully, and therefore I'm going to read to you what Wikipedia wrote about this information before we end. And yes, I did fact check it. Quote, in July 2018, Sandy Nichols of Indianapolis, Indiana, while going through her recently deceased mother's personal effects, discovered a dying declaration letter written by her grandfather, Father W. Glenn Martin, dated October 26, 1949. The handwritten envelope read, quote, in case of Margaret Ellen's or Glenna Jean's death, end quote, and was initialed WGM. The letter was written out of fear that one or both of his teenage daughters might be killed. The 3-page letter identified W. Glenn Martin as a paid LAPD police informant working for a Sergeant McCauley, LAPD Internal Affairs Division. He described his activities as working undercover for LAPD detectives to help them identify and arrest corrupt police officers. In his words, quote, it was to try and see if other officers could be involved in crime, end quote. The Martin letter, reproduced in full in the chapter afterward in the Black Dahlia Avenger 3, went on to name G.H. on 17 separate occasions, identifying him as a personal acquaintance of Martin's as well as of McCauley's, and named him as the killer of both Short and of a second woman, Louise Springer, the Green Twig murder victim. Martin's letter claimed that both he and G.H. personally knew Springer and that he believed G.H. had also killed her. LAPD at that time was actively investigating the Springer and Black Dahlia murders and had publicly identified them as, quote, possibly connected, end quote. Springer was garroted on June 13, 1949, just 2 blocks from where Short's body was found in 1947. Included in the letter was the fact that the LAPD, after being informed that G.H. knew victim Springer, brought G.H. in to be, quote, grilled about the Springer murder, end quote. The Martin letter made it clear that G.H. was known and protected by law enforcement officers and that they let him go. Martin's instructions were that this letter was only to be opened in case of harm coming to either of his daughters. No harm had come to either of them, so the letter remained unreported and in the family's possession for 70 years until discovered and read by Martin's granddaughter. The information in these letters reestablishes the timeline and the fact that the LAPD undercover agent Martin named George Hodel to LAPD detectives in June or July of 1949. The letter established that LAPD suspected and brought Hodel in for questioning and quote-unquote grilled him on both the Louise Springer and Elizabeth Short murders some 3 months prior to his incest arrest of his daughter in October of that same year, end quote. The police knew he was a suspect, knew he more than likely did it, but were protecting him because he was an informant or friends with an informant. It's weird because it doesn't say that George Hodel was the informant. So why would he have been being protected? Unless he was an informant. I don't know. Let me know what you guys think about that one in the comments. Last but certainly not least, and then I'll let you make up your own mind about who was guilty in this case, whether or not it's still unsolved, even if it will always officially be that way or not. Regardless of what you believe or don't believe, please let me know how you feel and why in the comments below. I would love to see this one become a real discussion in those comments, and I can't wait to read it all. Okay, so quoting the same source here, quote, after Hodel died in 1999, his son Steve Hodel, a former LAPD homicide detective, started investigating his father as a possible suspect in the Elizabeth Short murder and has written several books on the subject. A September 2006 episode of Cold Case Files, hosted by Bill Curtis, illustrates the mixed reaction to Steve Hodel's hypotheses as outlined in his first book, Black Dahlia Avenger, 2003. Head Deputy District Attorney Stephen Kay described himself as highly impressed by Steve Hodel's research and conclusions, and even went so far as to declare that this case had been solved. Less impressed was active detective Brian Carr, the LAPD officer then in charge of the Black Dahlia case, which was still officially open. Carr's opinion was that Hodel's theory was based on a few intriguing facts linked together by unsubstantiated supposition. Short's relatives also disagreed that the photos in Hodel's album were of Short. Carr added that if he ever took a case as weak as Steve Hodel's to a prosecutor, he would be, quote, laughed out of the office, end quote. Carr, admitting that he had not read all of Steve Hodel's materials, added, quote, I don't have time to either prove or disprove Hodel's investigation. I'm too busy working on active cases, end quote. Steve Hodel has since produced 2 additional books on the Dahlia case and several books on the Zodiac Killer and other cases, attempting to link them as well to his father, end quote. I am sorry, Detective Carr, you don't have time to look into possibly solving the Black Dahlia murder because you're too busy on cases that you're an asshole, in my opinion. I've dived deep myself into this man, also possibly being the Zodiac Killer, but haven't yet gone down all of the necessary rabbit holes in order to form a real opinion about it. But if you'd like me to cover that one, like this one in the near future, once I'm done with the research, please let me know. For now, though, that's all I have for you today, guys. Please give this video a big thumbs up if you enjoyed the content. If you enjoyed hanging out with me, spread the love by sharing this video. Subscribe if you haven't already, and check out the description box for some important links. Oh, make sure your notification bell is turned on as well to ensure that I get paid for all of the hard work that I do. If you're able to donate to PayPal or Cash App, the link is in the description box. Also, my Amazon wish list gift link. The links to all of my books, Kindle, paperback, and Audible, should be in the description box, but there are a lot of them, so if I missed one, or if you're looking for a specific book but maybe can't remember the title or anything like that, just go to Amazon and type in Gemma Jade Books, and you will find my entire collection. Gone Mysterious Disappearances, Volume 5, should be available on February 25th. I'm pretty sure this video will be coming out before then, but keep your eyes peeled and your ears open for that one if you want autographed copies of any or all of my books, the whole collection. I'm also thinking of putting the Gone series into a collective work, so Gone 1 through 5 in one big volume on Kindle and paperback. So if you want autographed copies of any of those, you can email me at GemmaJadeParanormal@gmail.com. My Amazon wish list gift link. My birthday is March 1st. A lot of y'all have asked me what I would like. I would like financial donations for my birthday, but if you really want to send me a gift, my Amazon wish list gift link is in the description box, and there are thousands of things that I want or really need on that list that you can send me and help me out with, or just say happy birthday, whatever the case may be. You can also email me for more information about personal intuitive oracle readings, either general remotes or the video readings. Also, my spiritual helper boxes, my subscription services, just anything and everything I offer outside of YouTube, but having to do with my spirituality and my spiritual businesses as well, because I don't have an active website right now. GemmaJadeParanormal@gmail.com. Also, to send in your encounters with the supernatural, paranormal, extraterrestrial, otherworldly, and for any and all other correspondence. Please support my channel by watching the YouTube shorts. All right, those are a really big part of why I've been able to bring in so many additional subscribers over the past year and a half. about the year and a half that I've been doing them. I know a lot of y'all don't use other forms of social media, but Facebook, you can find me. I'm just Gemma Jade. TikTok, GemmaJadeYT. I am on Instagram and Twitter as GemmaJadeYT, but I'm still learning how to use those platforms. So you can find me on there and I'll definitely accept you or link up with you on those platforms. But don't expect much content yet because I'm still learning how to use those platforms and can barely get a handle on the 80 to 90 hours a week I work on YouTube, basically for free unless you guys donate. Check out our live streams. Be kind to each other, guys. It doesn't cost anything. Be kind to yourselves and never accept anything less than others being kind to you. If nobody told you today, you're amazing, you're incredible. Try to do everything you can to switch your mindset from one of lack to one of abundance and watch the universe move and really work for you. Work to help you to achieve your dreams, your goals, and the destiny you contracted for yourself. I believe in you. I got your back. Always go in grace. Smile at a stranger. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye.